The Duke of Ashford stood at the edge of the ballroom and watched the woman he had destroyed dance with another man. She was laughing. He had not seen her laugh in 3 years because he had made sure he would never have to. Except he hadn't. And that was the thing that was slowly killing him. Nobody had introduced them properly. That was the part James Ashford remembered most clearly. Even now, the absence of a formal introduction. The way it had simply happened. The way she had simply been there one evening at the Hargrove dinner, and then continued to be there at the next gathering, and the one after that, until her presence stopped feeling like a coincidence and started feeling like something he had been waiting for without knowing it. Cecilia Voss was not the most beautiful woman in any room she entered. She would have been the first to say so, and she would have said it without self-pity, which was precisely what made her remarkable. She had steady gray eyes and an unhurried way of speaking, and the particular kind of composure that does not come from wealth or breeding, but from having learned, early and without much help, how to absorb difficulty without showing the seams. She was the daughter of a country solicitor, educated above her station by a father who believed books mattered more than dowries, and she had come to London at 24 to serve as a companion to her widowed cousin, a respectable arrangement, comfortable enough, though everyone in their circle understood what it meant. It meant she was dependent. It meant she was tolerated. It meant that when the truly important guests arrived, Cecilia was expected to find somewhere quieter to be. She never did, though. Not rudely, she was never rude, but she had this habit of simply remaining where she was, as if the unspoken rules of a room did not quite apply to her, not out of defiance but out of a kind of genuine unawareness that anyone would consider her presence an inconvenience. James had found this extraordinary. He had spent his entire life in rooms that rearranged themselves around his title, and here was a woman who did not rearrange herself for anyone. They had talked, that first evening, about nothing consequential, a disagreement over whether the fish course had been adequately seasoned, a remark she made about one of the paintings in the Hargrove Hall that was so precise and so quietly funny that he had laughed before he could stop himself. She had not seemed pleased by this in the way women usually seemed pleased when they made him laugh. She had simply smiled, as if she had only been stating the obvious, and moved on. He had thought about that smile for 3 days afterward. What followed was not a courtship, not officially. There was no declaration of intent, no approach to her cousin, no public acknowledgement of any kind. There was only a series of evenings in which James found himself crossing rooms he had not intended to cross, and a series of conversations that lasted longer than either of them seemed to notice, and a gradual, quiet, entirely unspoken understanding that had settled between them like something that had always been there. 8 months of that. 8 months of almost. His mother had noticed, of course. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford noticed everything that had the potential to disappoint her, and Cecilia Voss, with her solicitor father and her companion's salary and her complete indifference to the architecture of social performance, had the potential to disappoint her enormously. James had not worried about this. He had, in fact, been preparing for the conversation, rehearsing it in his mind with the quiet confidence of a man who had made his decision and simply needed to announce it. He had been, for the first time in his adult life, certain. He had been certain on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Cecilia was gone. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, which was the kind of detail that lodges itself in the memory for no rational reason and stays there forever. Cecilia had been at breakfast, alone. Her cousin had taken to sleeping late that season, when the footman brought it in on a small silver tray as though it were something precious. She had recognized the seal immediately. She had seen it once before, pressed into dark wax on a dinner invitation, and she had thought then that it was a serious-looking thing, that seal, heavy, certain of itself. She opened it the way she did most things, carefully, without hurry, without allowing herself to want anything from it before she knew what it contained. It took her approximately 40 seconds to read. Miss Voss, upon reflection, I find that the nature of our recent acquaintance has been permitted to develop beyond what is appropriate or advisable. I write to clarify that no understanding exists between us, nor will any be sought. I trust you will appreciate the candor of this communication, and I ask that you not make any attempt at further contact. I wish you well in your future arrangements. Ashford. She read it twice, not because she had failed to understand it the first time, but because she was the kind of woman who believed in being certain before she acted. Then she folded it along its original crease, placed it back in the envelope, and finished her tea. She did not cry. This was not because she was not hurt. She was hurt in the way that a very clean, very precise cut hurts, the kind that takes a moment to register before the depth of it becomes clear. She was hurt, and she was something else as well, something harder to name, something that sat just beneath the hurt and held it up. She had been wrong about him. She had been certain, in the quiet way she was certain about very few things, that she had not been wrong about him. And she had been wrong about that too. That was almost worse than the letter itself. She told her cousin that morning that she would be returning to the country. Her cousin, who was not unkind but was easily distracted, expressed surprise and mild inconvenience, and then asked whether Cecilia thought the weather would hold through the weekend. Cecilia said she thought it probably would. She packed that afternoon. 2 trunks, 1 smaller bag. She left behind a pair of gloves she had forgotten in the hallway closet, and a copy of a novel she had been halfway through and had no desire to finish any more. She did not write back to James. She did not send word. She did not ask why or how or what she had misread so completely. There was nothing to ask. The letter had been perfectly clear. What nobody knew, what nobody would know for 3 years, was that James Ashford had spent that same Wednesday in a meeting with his estate lawyers that had lasted from 9 in the morning until well past 4 in the afternoon, and had returned home to find his mother at her writing desk looking precisely as she always looked, composed and correct and entirely satisfied with herself, and had noticed nothing unusual at all. He had sent no letter. He did not yet know that one had been sent in his name. He did not yet know that the seal on the silver tray had been pressed by his mother's hand. He did not yet know any of it. And so, when Cecilia Voss left London the following morning without a word, without a note, without even the courtesy of a goodbye, James Ashford sat with the particular bewilderment of a man who cannot explain a wound he cannot find, and decided, slowly and painfully and incorrectly, that he had simply been mistaken about what they were to each other. He had been certain on a Tuesday. By Friday, he was certain about nothing at all. 3 years is long enough to build a life. It is not always long enough to stop listening for something that never comes. Cecilia learned this the way she learned most things, quietly, and without telling anyone. She had gone to her mother's elder sister in Derbyshire, a practical woman named Mrs. Holt who asked no difficult questions and expected useful behavior in return, which suited Cecilia perfectly. The village was small and unhurried and entirely uninterested in the social architecture of London, and within 6 months Cecilia had opened a small school for the daughters of local tradesmen. Reading, letters, basic arithmetic, a little French for the ones who wanted it. It was not what she had imagined for herself at 24. It was, she told herself firmly, enough. She was good at it. The girls liked her because she did not speak to them as though childhood were a condition to be endured on the way to something more serious, and their mothers liked her because she was sensible and reliable and charged less than she probably should have. By the 2nd year she had 14 students. By the 3rd, she had 22 and a second room and a young woman named Agnes who came in 3 mornings a week to help with the younger ones. She did not think about James Ashford every day. This was true. There had been a period in those first months when she had thought about him with a frequency that she found humiliating in retrospect, not with longing, or not only with longing, but with that particular obsessive quality of a mind trying to locate its own error. Where had she misread him? What had she missed? What had she allowed herself to believe that she should not have believed? She had gone over it until it was worn smooth, and then she had put it away. The way you put away something that has no further use but that you cannot quite bring yourself to discard. After that it was less constant, A week might pass without him entering her mind at all. Then something small and entirely unrelated, the smell of a particular wood fire, a certain quality of winter light through tall windows, someone laughing in another room, and there he was again. Not painfully, just present. The way a scar is present. You stop noticing it until something presses on it. News reached her occasionally, whether she wanted it or not. Mrs. Holt had a friend in London who wrote long letters full of society gossip, delivered with the confidence of someone reporting historical fact. Through these letters, delivered to Mrs. Holt and occasionally read aloud at the breakfast table with cheerful indifference to Cecilia's expression, she learned things she had not asked to know. That the Duke of Ashford had been briefly engaged to a Lord Somebody's eldest daughter the winter after Cecilia left. That the engagement had been dissolved before spring, no explanation given publicly, which meant the explanation was either scandalous or sad or both. That he had then, somewhat surprisingly, volunteered for a military posting, not conscripted, volunteered, and had spent 14 months abroad. That he had returned changed, according to Mrs. Holt's correspondent, though changed was doing a great deal of work in that sentence without being asked to be specific. That he was drinking more than was advisable. That he had stopped attending most social engagements. That Lady Ashford, his mother, had apparently taken to hosting dinners without him, and explaining his absence with the serene confidence of a woman who has decided that her version of events is the only one that requires circulation. Cecilia listened to all of this at the breakfast table with her hands around her teacup, and her face arranged into the expression of someone only mildly interested, which was a thing she had become very skilled at. She did not ask follow-up questions. She did not write to anyone in London. She told herself, on the evenings when the school was quiet and Agnes had gone home and the fire was low, that she had made the correct decision. That a man who could write a letter like that, cold, efficient, final, without a single word that acknowledged what had been between them, was not a man she had actually known. That she had invented him, partially or wholly, out of her own wishes. That the version of James Ashford she had mourned did not exist and had never existed, and it was therefore not mourning at all, not really, just the slow correction of a mistake. She was almost entirely convinced of this by the end of the 3rd year. Almost. She had not wanted to come back to London. This was important later, when she thought about the series of small and seemingly insignificant decisions that had led to her standing in the Pembridge ballroom on a Thursday evening in March wearing a dress she had altered herself because she had not budgeted for a new one. None of it had been her idea. All of it had been her cousin. Margaret Voss, now Margaret Ellery, having married a pleasant and moderately wealthy solicitor the previous autumn, had written in January with the particular energy of a newly settled woman who has decided that everyone she knows should also be settled, and soon. She was hosting a small season. She had a spare room. She knew several perfectly agreeable gentlemen. She had used the word asterisk opportunity 4 times in 2 pages, which Cecilia recognized as a warning sign, but had chosen to interpret as affection. She had said no twice. Margaret had written back both times as though Cecilia had said yes, and simply needed logistical confirmation. By the 3rd letter, Cecilia had been tired, and it had been February, and Derbyshire in February has a way of making London sound like a reasonable idea. She had told herself it would be 1 season, 12 weeks at the outside. She would be pleasant company for Margaret, attend the necessary engagements, smile at the perfectly agreeable gentleman, and return to Derbyshire in June with her life exactly as she had left it. She was 27 years old, and she was not under any illusions about what 12 weeks in London could or could not produce, and she was perfectly at peace with that. She had not accounted for the Pembridge ball. She had not accounted for Lord Ellery's colleague, a cheerful widower named Mr. Davies, who had asked her to dance twice and made her laugh genuinely on both occasions, which she had not expected, and which had, she admitted privately, felt rather nice. She had not accounted for the fact that James Ashford would be there. She did not see him immediately. The ballroom was full and warm and bright with candlelight, and she had been in the middle of a conversation with Mr. Davies about the particular misery of long carriage rides when she became aware, without being able to say precisely how, that something in the room had shifted. It was not a sound or a movement. It was more like a change in pressure. The way the air feels different before a storm, before there is any visible evidence of one. She looked up. He was standing at the far edge of the room near the tall windows, a glass in his hand, not speaking to anyone. He was thinner than she remembered. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there 3 years ago, and something in his posture that was different, still upright, still composed in the way his rank required, but underneath it a kind of tiredness that she recognized because she had felt it herself. The tiredness of someone who has been holding something carefully for a very long time. He was looking directly at her. She did not look away. This was a decision she made in approximately half a second, and she made it consciously. She would not look away. She would not color. She would not give him the satisfaction of knowing that the sight of him had done anything to her at all. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to make the point, and then she turned back to Mr. Davies and said something about carriage roads that she could not afterward remember. And she smiled, and she laughed at whatever he said next, and she was aware with every nerve in her body that James Ashford was still watching. Good, she thought. Let him watch. What she did not allow herself to examine, not then, not in that bright and crowded room, was what she had seen in his expression in that half-second before she looked away. It had not been guilt. It had not been the careful blankness of a man who regrets something and has decided indifference is the cleanest way to carry it. It had been something rawer than that, something that looked against all reason, against everything she knew and everything she had spent 3 years carefully concluding, almost like devastation. She did not think about this. She danced with Mr. Davies a 3rd time, and she was perfectly charming. And when the evening ended, she took Margaret's arm and walked out into the cold night air, and said nothing at all the entire way home. Margaret, who was perceptive in the way that happily married women sometimes become perceptive about unhappy situations in others, did not ask. She simply held Cecilia's arm a little tighter. And Cecilia, who had spent 3 years being absolutely fine, stared at the dark street ahead and breathed very carefully and told herself that whatever she had seen in his face meant nothing. She was almost certain of it. He found her 3 days later at a garden party she had not particularly wanted to attend. It was the kind of early spring afternoon that London occasionally produces as an apology for February, pale sunshine. The smell of new grass, women in light shawls pretending it, was warmer than it was. Cecilia had been standing near the rose arbor with Margaret and 2 of Margaret's friends, listening to a conversation about upholstery fabric with the polite attention of someone who has decided that upholstery fabric is as good a subject as any, when she heard his voice behind her. Miss Voss. Not Cecilia. They had never been on first-name terms, not officially, and yet somehow, over 8 months of long conversations and crossed rooms and almost, she had grown accustomed to the way he said her name, which was always as though it meant something specific to him, something beyond its syllables. He was not saying it that way now. Now it was precise and careful and correct, the voice of a duke addressing an acquaintance at a garden party, nothing more. She turned around. "Your Grace." Her voice was steady. She had known, from the moment she woke that morning with a vague sense of dread she had refused to examine, that something like this was coming. She had dressed accordingly, her best day dress, her spine very straight, her expression arranged into the pleasant neutrality she had perfected over 3 years of breakfast tables and local assemblies, and every other situation that required her to feel one thing and show another. He looked in daylight worse than he had at the ball, or perhaps more accurately, more honest. The candlelight had softened him. Daylight did not. She could see clearly now the hollows beneath his eyes and the particular set of his jaw that she remembered from evenings when something had been troubling him, and he was not yet ready to say what it was. She had learned to read that jaw. She wished she hadn't. "I hoped I might find you here," he said. "Did you?" It was not a question. A brief pause. Margaret and her friends had engaged in the sudden collective discovery that the rose arbor required their immediate attention elsewhere, which Cecilia noted with equal parts gratitude and irritation. "You look well," James said. "Thank you." She did not return the observation, because she was not prepared to lie to him, and she was not prepared to tell him the truth either. Another pause. He was not a man who was usually uncomfortable with silence. That had been one of the things she had noticed first about him, the way he did not feel compelled to fill every gap with noise the way most people did. But he was uncomfortable now. She could see him selecting and discarding words with an uncharacteristic lack of certainty, and some part of her that she could not entirely suppress found this both satisfying and painful in equal measure. "I was not aware you had returned to London," he said finally. "I arrived in February." "I see." A muscle moved in his jaw. "And you are settling in well." "Perfectly well, thank you." "Good," he looked at her. "That's good." Cecilia regarded him with the composed gray gaze that had unnerved better conversationalists than him. "Was there something you wished to say to me, Your Grace? Only I find I am not particularly well suited to discussing the weather with you." Something shifted in his expression. The careful social surface cracked, just slightly, just for a moment, and underneath it she caught a glimpse of something that was not the practiced composure of a duke at a garden party, but something considerably more unguarded, more urgent, more. He stopped it, smoothed it back over, returned to correct. "I simply wish to acknowledge," he said carefully, "that our parting was perhaps handled poorly, on my part." Cecilia looked at him for a long moment. Handled poorly. 3 years. 22 students and a second room and every breakfast table in Derbyshire, and 14 months of him drinking more than was advisable, according to Mrs. Holt's correspondent. And he was standing in front of her in the pale spring sunshine telling her it had been handled poorly. "I appreciate that," she said pleasantly. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." She turned and walked back toward the house at a pace that was unhurried and entirely deliberate, and did not once suggest that her heart was beating considerably faster than it should have been. James watched her go. He stood very still for a moment, the sound of the garden party continuing around him as though nothing had happened, and he thought about what she had just done. She had not been cold exactly. Cold would have been something, cold would have been a reaction, an indication that he still warranted one. She had been pleasant. She had been correct. She had looked at him with those steady gray eyes, and treated him with the precise degree of polite distance she might extend to someone she had met briefly once at a forgettable dinner, and barely remembered afterward. She had not said, "Why did you send it?" She had not said, "How could you?" She had not said anything that suggested 3 years ago had mattered at all. He had braced himself without realizing it for anger. Anger he could have worked with. Anger meant something was still there, still alive, still worth the effort of explanation. This was worse than anger. This was a woman who had finished grieving and moved on and was now simply living her life, and he was a footnote in it at best. A poorly handled parting, acknowledged and dismissed. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." He walked home in the thin spring sunshine and thought about the letter he had never written. He had been avoiding the question of the letter for 3 years. It had sat at the back of his mind like a door he had refused to open, because opening it meant examining the only conclusion it led to, which was that someone had sent it deliberately in his name to a woman he had, to Cecilia, and that the someone in question was one of very few people with access to his seal and his household, and his mother had always. He stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the pavement, while London moved around him, and he thought, with a clarity that felt like cold water, about his mother at her writing desk that Thursday evening. Composed, correct, entirely satisfied with herself. He started walking again, faster this time. The letter from Thomas Greer arrived on a Monday. James almost did not open it. The name meant little to him at first glance. Greer had served as his private secretary for less than a year, almost 4 years ago now. A quiet and efficient man who had left his employment without much explanation shortly after, and the handwriting on the envelope was shaky in a way that suggested either age or illness or both. James had set it aside twice before opening it on a Tuesday evening, more out of obligation than curiosity. He read it standing at his desk. He did not sit down. He did not move at all, in fact, for quite some time after he finished. It was 4 pages long. The handwriting deteriorated as it went, the lines growing less steady toward the end, but the content was precise. Greer, it emerged, was dying consumption. The doctors had given him weeks and had decided, with the particular urgency of a man approaching an accounting he could no longer postpone, that there were things he could not take with him without saying them first. He had written the letter to Cecilia Voss. He had composed it himself in James's study on a Thursday afternoon in October 3 years ago, while James had been in a meeting with his estate lawyers. He had used James's stationery. He had used James's seal. He had delivered it himself to the Ellery house on Cavendish Street and watched the footman carry it inside on a small silver tray. He had done all of this because the Dowager Duchess of Ashford had instructed him to. The instructions had been delivered verbally in the Dowager's private sitting room on the Wednesday evening prior. Greer had been summoned after dinner and presented with a draft, the Dowager's own handwriting, he specified. He could still see it clearly, and told that this letter was to be copied onto the Duke's stationery, sealed with the Duke's seal, and delivered the following day without the Duke's knowledge. He had been told that this was a matter of protecting the family. He had been told that the woman in question was unsuitable, and that the Duke lacked the resolve to make the necessary separation himself. He had been told, with the serene certainty of a woman who had never once doubted her own authority, that this was simply what was required. He had done it because he had been afraid of her. He wrote this plainly, without excuse. He had been afraid of the Dowager Duchess of Ashford in the way that people who depend on the goodwill of powerful women learn to be afraid thoroughly, practically, without much hope of resistance. He had told himself it was not his business. He had told himself the Duke would move on quickly. He had told himself a great many things over 3 years, and none of them had been sufficient, and now he was dying and he was telling the truth instead. He had enclosed with the letter 2 items. The first was the Dowager's original draft, 4 lines in her precise, familiar handwriting, the ink slightly faded now but entirely legible. The second was a brief note in his own hand confirming that he was prepared, should it be required, to make a sworn statement before a solicitor. He had already arranged this with a local man, he wrote. It would be done by the end of the week regardless of whether James responded. He was not asking permission. He was simply informing. James read the letter a second time. Then he sat down. He sat at his desk for a long time in the quiet of his study, the fire burning low, the original draft in his mother's handwriting on the desk in front of him, and he thought about Cecilia Voss packing 2 trunks and a smaller bag on a Thursday afternoon, and leaving London the following morning without a word. He thought about what she must have felt reading a letter she believed he had written, cold, efficient, final, not a single word that acknowledged what had been between them. He thought about her at 24, too proud to ask why, too certain of what the letter meant to question it, carrying it back to Derbyshire and building a school and becoming absolutely fine. He thought about 3 years. He thought about a garden party and good afternoon, Your Grace, and the particular quality of being treated as a footnote. He picked up his mother's draft. Upon reflection, I find that the nature of our recent acquaintance has been permitted to develop beyond what is appropriate or advisable. He set it back down. He had gone to his mother's rooms once, 2 years ago, in a darker period, and asked her directly whether she had done anything to interfere with Cecilia's departure. His mother had looked at him with the expression she reserved for questions she considered beneath serious engagement, and said that she had done what any mother would do for a son who lacked the clarity to act in his own interest, and that the girl was gone, and the matter was settled, and she trusted he would have the sense to leave it there. He had not asked what anything meant. He had not pressed. He understood now with a clarity that was not comfortable, a coward. He had been grieving and confused, and it had been easier to accept that Cecilia had gone than to pursue the question of why, because pursuing it might have led somewhere he did not have the strength to go. He had been a coward, and his mother had known it, and she had counted on it. He stood up. He needed to find Cecilia. He needed to find her before she decided anything. About Mr. Davies, about London, about the 12 weeks she had apparently allotted herself before returning to Derbyshire and her school and her life that did not include him. He needed to find her and show her the letter and his mother's draft and Greer's sworn statement, and he needed to do it without making it about what he wanted, because what he wanted was not the point, not yet, possibly not ever. The point was that she deserved to know the truth and she had been denied it for 3 years, and that was a debt that had nothing to do with his own feelings and everything to do with simple justice. He picked up the documents from his desk. He stopped. He put them back down. He stood very still for a moment and acknowledged, honestly, for the first time in 3 years, what it actually was that he felt. Not the managed version, not the acceptable version, not the version he had been presenting to himself in the interest of getting through consecutive days without doing something inadvisable. He had loved her. He had loved her in the specific and inconvenient way that does not resolve itself with time or distraction or 14 months abroad or any number of evenings spent convincing yourself that certainty was the same thing as stupidity. He had loved her, and he had lost her to a letter he had never written, and he had spent 3 years not knowing it, and she had spent 3 years not knowing it either, and the person responsible was currently hosting a small dinner in the East Wing, and would be entirely untroubled by any of this unless he did something about it. He picked up the documents again. This time, he did not put them back down. He went to her the following morning. Margaret Ellery's house on Cavendish Street was a narrow, well-kept townhouse with window boxes that had not yet decided what season it was, and James stood in front of it for approximately 30 seconds longer than was necessary before knocking. He was carrying the documents in a leather folio under his arm. He had dressed carefully, which he recognized as irrelevant and had done anyway. The housemaid showed him to a small sitting room and left him there. He waited. He heard her before he saw her footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, and then a pause just outside the door that lasted long enough to tell him she had been informed who was calling and had taken a moment to decide how to enter. When she came in, she was composed and neatly dressed, and her gray eyes went immediately to the folio under his arm with the instinct of someone who has learned to read situations quickly. "Your Grace," she did not sit, "this is unexpected. I apologize for calling without notice." He did not sit either. "I need to show you something. I would ask that you look at it before you say anything if you're willing." A brief pause. Something moved across her face, not quite wariness, not quite curiosity, something balanced carefully between the two. "Very well," she said. He opened the folio and held out Greer's letter first. She took it with steady hands and read it. He watched her face and saw very little, a slight stillness around her eyes, a controlled quality to her breathing that suggested effort. When she finished, she held out her hand for the next document without speaking, and he gave her his mother's draft. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she set both documents down on the small table beside her, and stood very quietly for a moment with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the middle distance, and James waited, and the sitting room was very still. A dying man, she said finally. Her voice was even. A convenient confession, and here you are. He had expected this. He had prepared for it, and still it landed somewhere uncomfortable. I understand why you would think that, he said. Do you? She looked at him now directly with those clear gray eyes that had always seen rather more than was entirely comfortable. 3 years, Your Grace. You had 3 years to investigate this, to ask questions, to— She stopped, collected herself, continued more quietly. You came to me at a garden party and told me our parting had been handled poorly. And now a dying man produces a confession, and suddenly here you are with documents. The letter from Greer arrived Monday. I came as soon as. I am not questioning your timing. She said it precisely, without heat. I am questioning why it required a dying man's confession for you to ask the question at all. The silence that followed was not comfortable for either of them. She was right. He knew she was right, and she knew he knew it, and they both stood in the small sitting room with that knowledge between them, solid and inconvenient. I went to my mother 2 years ago, he said. I asked her directly. She said— He stopped, heard how it sounded, continued anyway. She told me she had done what any mother would do and that the matter was settled. And you accepted that? Yes. Another silence. I was not in a state at that time to— He stopped again. He had rehearsed this conversation, and he was finding that the rehearsed version bore very little resemblance to the actual one. I was not well, after you left. I am not offering that as an excuse. I am simply being accurate. Cecilia looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not unkind. It was, in some ways, worse than unkind. It was the expression of someone who is trying very hard to be fair, which meant she was not yet certain what fairness required. Mr. Davies has asked to call on me, she said. James went very still. He is a good man, she continued. Sensible, warm. He has a daughter of 9 who needs a steady hand, and he has been honest with me about what he is looking for and what he can offer. She paused. I have not given him an answer. Cecilia, I would ask you not to use my Christian name, Your Grace. The correction landed precisely where it was intended to. Forgive me, he looked at her. I am not asking you to decide anything based on— I am not here to ask anything of you. I came because you deserve to know the truth. Whatever you do with it is entirely yours. He paused. But I would ask only that you do not make any decision until you have had time to. Time? She said the word with a quality he could not entirely read. I have had rather a lot of time. I know. 3 years is a considerable amount of time, Your Grace. In 3 years I built something, a school, a life. I did not spend 3 years waiting. I want to be clear about that. I was not waiting. I know, he said again quietly. I know you weren't. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The document sat on the small table between them, Greer's shaky handwriting and his mother's precise 4 lines, the whole architecture of a ruined thing laid out in ink and paper. I need you to go, she said, not coldly, simply. Yes, he picked up the folio. May I leave these with you? A pause, then yes. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. He did not say what he wanted to say, because she had not asked him what he felt, and she had been very clear about what she needed from him right now, and what she needed was for him to go. But he stood in the doorway for one moment, his back to her, and he said the only thing he could say that was true and necessary and entirely without pressure. You deserved better than what happened to you. I am sorry I did not fight harder to find out why. He left before she could respond. He did not know whether she watched him go. He did not know that she stood very still in the small sitting room for a long time after the front door closed, her hands folded, her breathing careful, her eyes on Greer's letter and her mother's, on * his mother's draft, the 4 lines in the precise handwriting that had rearranged her life. And he did not know that she pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth in the way that people do when they are keeping something in that very much wants to come out. He did not know that Margaret Ellery appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later and found her still standing there, and said nothing, and simply came and stood beside her. He was already home, sitting at his desk, staring at nothing, when his butler informed him that Miss Voss's cousin had sent a note. He opened it. It was not from Cecilia. It was from Margaret. She is leaving for Derbyshire on Friday, the morning coach. I thought you should know. I am not certain why I am telling you this. I suspect you are. M. Ellery. James read it twice. Then he looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. Friday was 3 days away. He did not go to her on Wednesday. This was a decision, not an oversight. He had learned across the wreckage of the past 3 years that the moments when he most wanted to act were frequently the moments that most required him to stop. Cecilia Voss was not a woman who responded to pressure. She was a woman who responded to truth, delivered cleanly and without agenda, and then made up her own mind in her own time, and any attempt to accelerate that process would only confirm what she already suspected, that he had come to her with documents and a confession because he wanted something from her, not because she deserved it. So he did not go on Wednesday. He did not go on Thursday either, though Thursday was considerably harder. He spent most of it at his desk attempting correspondence and producing very little. He wrote to Greer's solicitor confirming receipt of the sworn statement. He drafted and discarded 4 letters to Cecilia, each one wrong in a different way, too much, too little, too urgent, too careful. He burned all 4 in the fireplace and sat watching the ash and thought about Friday. He thought about Mr. Davies, who was sensible and warm and had a daughter of 9. He thought about a school in Derbyshire and 22 students, and a woman who had built something real from the wreckage of a Wednesday morning, and a letter she had not deserved. He thought about what it would mean to let her go again, not as it had happened before, not through ignorance and cowardice and his mother's precise handwriting, but consciously, deliberately, because she had made her choice and he respected it. He tested this thought carefully, the way you test ice before stepping onto it, looking for the point at which it would give way. It held, barely, and with considerable discomfort, but it held. If she chose Mr. Davies, he would not interfere. He was tolerably certain he would not survive it, but he would not interfere. On Friday morning he was dressed and downstairs by 7 o'clock with no clear plan, and the leather folio under his arm out of habit, though it contained nothing new. His carriage was ready. He had not told the driver where they were going because he had not yet decided whether he was going anywhere at all. He stood in the entrance hall of Ashford House for several minutes in the early morning quiet, his coat on, his hat in his hand, and he had a conversation with himself that was not particularly dignified but was entirely honest. And at the end of it, he put on his hat and got into the carriage and told the driver the coaching in on the Marylebone Road. He arrived 20 minutes before the Derbyshire coach was due to depart. The inn yard was already busy, ostlers and luggage, and the particular organized chaos of an early morning departure. He spotted Margaret Ellery first, standing to one side with the expression of a woman who has inserted herself into a situation and is now questioning the wisdom of it. She saw him at the same moment. Her eyes went wide. Then she looked deliberately in the opposite direction, which James interpreted as permission. Cecilia was near the coach. Her trunks were already loaded, 2 of them, and a smaller bag, which he noticed with a pain that was entirely disproportionate to the observation. She was speaking to the coachman, something practical about the route, and she had not yet seen him. He crossed the yard. She heard his footsteps on the cobblestones. He saw the moment she did, the slight straightening of her spine, the almost imperceptible pause before she finished her sentence to the coachman and turned around. She looked at him, he looked at her. Around them the yard continued its noise and movement, entirely indifferent. "Your Grace," she said, not unwelcoming, not warm, somewhere carefully in between. "Miss Voss." He stopped a correct distance away. He had thought on the way here about what he was going to say, and he had decided that most of it was wrong, too much, too late, too self-serving. He had reduced it on the journey to its necessary parts, and then reduced it further, until what remained was the only thing that was entirely true and entirely hers, and cost him nothing to give her except the last of his dignity. He reached into the folio and produced a single document, not Greer's letter, not his mother's draft, but something new. A single page in his own handwriting, written at 3 o'clock that morning when sleep had stopped being a reasonable expectation. He held it out. She looked at it, she looked at him. "You don't have to read it now," he said. "You don't have to read it at all, but I would rather you had it." A long pause. The coachman called something about departure. Margaret made a small sound that she converted unconvincingly into a cough. Cecilia took the page. She did not read it. She folded it carefully and put it into her traveling bag, her eyes down, her hands steady. Then she looked up at him. He had prepared himself for several possible versions of this moment. He had prepared for cool politeness. He had prepared for anger, however delayed. He had even prepared, in his darker moments on Thursday night, for nothing at all, for her to simply board the coach and go, which would have been her right and which he would have accepted. He had not quite prepared for the way she was looking at him now. It was not the composed neutrality of the garden party. It was not the careful distance of the sitting room. It was something quieter than either, something that had less performance in it and more her. The gray eyes that saw too much, the slight uncertain quality around her mouth that she almost never let anyone see, the look of a woman who is trying very hard to know her own mind and finding it more complicated than she had hoped. "Whatever you decide," he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Whatever you go back to, or don't go back to, I want you to know that it matters to me that you know the truth, not because of what I want, because of what you deserved 3 years ago and didn't get." He took a step back. "Have a safe journey, Miss Voss." He turned. He had taken perhaps 4 steps when she spoke. "James." Not asterisk, your grace asterisk. Not a title. His name in her voice for the first time in 3 years, and it stopped him as completely as a hand on his arm. He turned back. She was still standing where he had left her, her traveling bag in her hands, the folded page inside it. She looked at him across the cobblestones with those clear gray eyes, and for a moment she said nothing at all, just looked, and he stood very still and let her. "I don't know," she said finally, quietly. "Just the two of them, the noise of the yard somehow distant. I want you to understand that I don't know yet." "I know," he said. "I am not," she stopped, started again. 3 years is not nothing. What I built is not nothing. I am not going to set it aside because of a letter and a dying man's conscience," and she paused. "And whatever it is you wrote at 3 o'clock in the morning." The corner of his mouth moved. He couldn't help it. "How did you?" The ink was still slightly uneven. "You always pressed harder when you were tired." A pause. Then, almost against her will, the ghost of something that was nearly a smile. "I noticed things too." The yard moved around them. A horse stamped. Someone called out a departure warning. "Go," he said, gently. "Go back to your school. Read it when you're ready, or don't." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and boarded the coach, and the door closed, and the yard began its final preparations, and James stood on the cobblestones and did not move until the coach had passed through the gate and turned into the street and disappeared. Margaret appeared at his elbow. "Well," she said after a moment. "Well," he agreed. "She noticed your ink was uneven." "Yes." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then, "You should know she threw away Mr. Davies' flowers. Last Tuesday, I saw them in the kitchen bin." A pause. "I'm not saying that means anything." "No," James said, "of course not." But he stood in the inn yard for a moment longer than was necessary, his hat in his hand, the early morning light thin and pale over the London rooftops, and something that had been closed for 3 years opened, just slightly, just enough to let in a very cautious and entirely terrifying amount of hope. He walked back to his carriage. He went home. He waited. 14 months later, the church was small enough that everyone in it could hear everything, which suited the occasion perfectly because there was very little said that anyone wished to miss. It was a Tuesday in May, which Cecilia had chosen deliberately, and which James had understood immediately, and which neither of them had explained to anyone else. The guests had assumed it was a matter of calendar convenience. It was not a matter of calendar convenience. There were perhaps 40 people. No grand assembly, no procession of titles, no receiving line that lasted longer than the ceremony itself. Margaret sat in the third row and cried from the opening prayer, which she had predicted she would do and had prepared for with an exceptionally large handkerchief. Her husband patted her hand at intervals with the patient affection of a man who has accepted that he married a woman of considerable feeling and considers himself fortunate for it. Mrs. Holt had come down from Derbyshire and was sitting very upright in the second row, wearing her best hat and the expression of someone who has been proven right about something, and is exercising considerable restraint in not mentioning it. Agnes, who ran the school now with the assistance of 2 new teachers and an enrollment of 31, had sent a letter that morning because she could not make the journey but had wanted Cecilia to have something to open on the day. Cecilia had read it at breakfast and had not told James what it said, only that it was kind, and he had not asked. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford was not present. This had been managed with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has spent 3 years building things and knows how to construct something that lasts. There had been one conversation, conducted in the Dowager's private sitting room, with Greer's letter and the sworn statement and the original draft on the table between them, that had lasted 40 minutes and had not been pleasant, and at the end of which certain understandings had been reached. James had not been present for this conversation. He had offered to be. Cecilia had said she preferred to handle it herself, in the tone she used when she had already decided something and was informing him rather than consulting him, and he had learned by then that this tone was not an invitation to negotiate. He had never asked precisely what was said. He had noted that his mother had subsequently retired to the family's estate in Wiltshire and had not returned to London, and he had considered that sufficient. Cecilia did not wear white. This had caused a moderate amount of quiet commentary among the guests in the days preceding, the sort of commentary that people conduct in the belief that it is not reaching the person it concerns. It was reaching the person it concerned. Cecilia had noted it with the same equanimity she applied to most things and had continued with her plans. She wore deep blue, the color of a winter evening just before the light goes entirely, the color of something that has waited a long time and is no longer waiting. The dress had been made by a seamstress in Derbyshire whose work she had admired for 2 years, and it fit precisely as it should. And when she walked into the church on her Uncle Holt's arm and James turned around from the altar and saw her, he went very still in the way he always went still when something mattered more than he had prepared for. She had grown accustomed to this. She did not find it less affecting with familiarity. She did not look away this time. The ceremony itself was brief and traditional, and exactly what they had asked for, which was something that said what it meant, and meant what it said without requiring an hour to do it. When it was over and the small congregation had moved into the churchyard in the pale May sunshine, Mrs. Holt found herself standing near the door with an elderly woman she had not previously met. A greytan of James's, it transpired, a sharp-eyed woman of 70-something who had arrived from the country that morning, and whose opinion of the proceedings was not yet entirely clear. She wore blue, the greytan observed, watching Cecilia in the churchyard, James beside her, their heads together over something Margaret was saying. "She did," said Mrs. Holt. "Unconventional." "Yes." A pause. "She doesn't seem to mind," the greytan said. It was not quite a question. Mrs. Holt considered Cecilia in the sunshine, the straight spine, the steady gray eyes, The way she was laughing now at whatever Margaret had said, really laughing. The kind that couldn't be managed or arranged. The way James was looking at her while she laughed, with the expression of a man who has been permitted, against considerable odds, to keep something he had no right to expect. "No," said Mrs. Holt, "she never did." Later, when the guests had thinned and the afternoon was turning golden and someone had produced a very adequate Madeira that was circulating with more efficiency than was perhaps strictly proper, Margaret found herself near the church door with the elderly Greytant, watching the last of the afternoon light fall across the churchyard. "She wrote back, you know," Margaret said, "not to anyone in particular. After he came to the coaching inn, he waited 5 weeks and she wrote back." The Greytant raised an eyebrow. 1 letter in 5 weeks. 1 line, Margaret smiled into her glass. "He showed me once. He carries it still, I think, in his coat." 1 line, the Greytant repeated. "What did it say?" Margaret watched Cecilia cross the churchyard toward James, who was speaking to Mrs. Holt's husband, and turned at her approach with the immediate and entirely involuntary attention of a man who has been waiting for that particular footstep specifically. "I missed you too," Margaret said. The Greytant was quiet for a moment. Then she took a sip of her Madeira. "Well," she said, "that's enough, isn't it?" Margaret watched them in the golden afternoon light, James's hand finding Cecilia's without either of them looking down. The simple, unconscious certainty of it, as though they had been doing it for years and intended to continue indefinitely. "Yes," she said. "It really is." Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.